It's February of 2011, and on the stage of the quiz show Jeopardy stands the two greatest champions in the game's history. The first is Ken Jennings, who once won a staggering 74 games in a row. The second is Brad Rutter, who had never lost to another human. The two champions were also joined by a third player, a black monolith with a glowing globe for a face that IBM had spent 4 entire years building. Its name was Watson. And as riveting as the idea of a man playing Jeopardy against a machine was back in 2011, watching it go down in practice was, well, it was a far less riveting experience because it barely felt like a competition. You see, Watson was schooling the champions. It consistently buzzed in first, again and again, effortlessly generating the right answer to basically every question that was thrown at it. And why wouldn't it? It was drawing on 200 million pages of trivia that it had studied in advance. The champions could barely get a word in. It had looked like the thinking machine had finally arrived, and it was a full 11 years ahead of schedule. But at the end of the first game came the final Jeopardy.
Final Jeopardy category is U.S. cities, and here is the clue. Its largest airport is named for a World War II hero. Its second largest for a World War II battle. 30 seconds, players. Good luck.
What's your guess? I'll give you a second. If you said Chicago O'Hare, then congratulations. Your answer is that of champions, albeit human champions, but champions nonetheless. Now, Watson's response was, "What is Toronto?" Followed by precisely 5 question marks. Toronto, a machine that had just out-answered the best trivia players alive, did not know what any school child in the audience, and probably most school children across the world, know, which is Toronto is not a U.S. city. The same machine, the same night. Superhuman at one moment and completely clueless at another. Why? That seeming contradiction is the subject of today's discussion. During our last lecture, I showed you that every modern AI system is a pattern recognition machine built by guessing, checking, and nudging. So this naturally leads us to ask, where do pattern machines shine? And where do they start to fall apart? And why is the line never quite where we'd expect? By the end of this lesson, you'll have 2 questions you can ask to help you understand a machine's strengths, and you will know how to read the scoreboards that experts have built to measure what they are and are not good at. The kinds of mistakes that machines make are counterintuitive to the point of being honestly kind of funny. And it's because our human instincts about what should be hard for a machine are based on what is hard for us. And it turns out that that instinct is almost perfectly wrong. For example, on a scale of 1 to 10, how difficult would you say the following tasks are? Opening a door, turning a valve, climbing the stairs. If you're able-bodied, your answer will probably be something towards the easier end of that spectrum. So let's try another set of tasks. Again, rate it from 1 to 10. Mastering chess, learning 6 languages, painting the Mona Lisa. I would say that unless you're a polymath, you'd probably rate that second set of tasks as more difficult than the first. And here's the thing, for humans, that second set of tasks is more difficult for most humans. The problem comes when we assume that what's difficult for us will be difficult for the machines that we made in our own image. Do you remember how in lesson 1 you watched Deep Blue beat the world chess champion in 1997? What if we ask a machine to do what happens after the chess game? Pick up the pieces and just put them back in the chess box. In 1997, there was no single machine on Earth that could do that reliably. Even 20 years after that infamous chess match, fine motor skills continued to befuddle machines. In 2015, the American military ran a contest for the world's most advanced robots. Here's some of the tasks that they were testing. Open a door, turn a valve, climb the stairs. Does that list sound familiar? The highlight reel from that contest showed robot after robot toppling over like exhausted little toddlers trying futilely to accomplish what, from a human perspective, are stupefyingly simple tasks. Machines had been superhuman at chess for 18 years, but a simple doorknob remained a burden far too great to bear. Now, to be fair, AI for robotics has come a long way over the last few decades, but it's clear that there is still a large gap between machine capabilities on what we think of as hard tasks like playing chess or writing novels in comparison to the things that we intuitively find easy, like opening a door. Let's do a more recent example. In 2025, Amazon unveiled its first warehouse robot with a sense of touch. The big news? It can handle a whopping, and I'm not making this up, 3/4 of the items on the shelves. For the rest of the items, the other quarter, 25% of them, it has to call a human over. It seems that those incredible doorknob turning tools you have attached to your wrists remain a frontier technology, at least from the machine's perspective. This gap that I'm describing actually has a name. It's called Moravec's paradox, and it was coined by Hans Moravec in 1988. If I had to state it simply, it's that the hard problems are easy, and the easy problems are hard. And the reason for this is biological evolution. You see, the skills that feel effortless to you and me, seeing, grasping, walking, are also some of our oldest skills, biologically speaking, perfectly tuned over hundreds of millions of years through our own guess, check, nudge, albeit much more slowly in the biological ecosystem. But it's been so perfectly tuned that they run below your awareness. Chess and algebra, on the other hand, those arrived a few thousand years ago, and so they feel hard because they are new. Easy, it turns out, just means old. Remember that. So to understand what AI is good at and bad at, you have to first abandon your organic intuitions. Instead, to predict where a machine will be strong, you can ask 2 questions about the task itself. Question 1 is, how much practice material exists? In lesson 3, I showed you that these systems are statistics engines, and statistics need volume, lots of data. So look at where the world has piled up lots of examples by the billions. That's in topics like human speech, photographs, translated texts, and wherever that pile gets very deep, machines get astonishingly good at those tasks. The problem becomes old, in other words. For example, by 2017, speech systems transcribed phone calls about as accurately as professional human transcribers could. The same year, a Stanford network trained on 130,000 medical images matched 21 board-certified dermatologists at spotting skin cancer in photos on that narrow test. The machine had basically seen more moles than a doctor could examine in 10 careers. Conversely, where the examples are scarce, the machine's skills evaporate. Consider a disease with 40 known cases, or a global pandemic that nobody's ever lived through, your specific business, or details about your specific life, where the sample size is basically one. If the world's data holds few examples, the machine has barely practiced. The problem is new. The second question you need to ask to predict what machines will be good at is, what does ground truth actually depend on? You see, some tasks have very clear definitions of what a good or a bad outcome is. A chess game is either won or it's lost. Computer code either compiles or it crashes. A translation is either valid or invalid. But of course, not all tasks have these simple scoreboards. In some cases, there are several possible answers to any given question. And when those possible answers are finite and driven by consistent, easy to observe phenomena, then machines can use abduction, the principle we discussed in the last lecture, to help us find the best answer. See, the problem is not that machines can't perform abduction. It's that there are a set of questions where the best answer is either so qualitative or so contextually dependent that the effective data set the machine can pull from to help answer the question becomes basically non-existent. For example, consider the following questions. Is Survivor a good TV show? Is the PlayStation worth the price? Can you get rich from crypto? For questions like these, the answer is, it depends. And the set of factors it depends on can become so immense that after accounting for them all, the machine actually has very few, if any, examples to draw from when trying to reconstruct the most likely answer. So to summarize, machines do well at tasks where it's easy to keep score, and the scoreboard matters more than it sounds. When answers can be checked automatically, a machine can practice against itself and manufacture its own examples to generate practically infinite data. Remember AlphaGo from the first lecture? In 2017, its successor was given only the rules of Go and a win-or-lose signal. So there was no human games played at all. It never looked at the patterns of champions. It just played millions upon millions of games against itself. And within days, it beat the version that had beat Lee Sedol 100 games to 0. A clear scoreboard lets AI conjure the data out of thin air that it needs to do its task well. So where there is no scoreboard, the only judge that's left is a human, and humans are slow, and we disagree with each other all the time. The machines still improve at those tasks, don't get me wrong, but progress is murkier, and the claims about it are naturally harder to trust. If you take the two questions I provided earlier and you just lay out their answers on a map, you're going to get roughly 3 sections. One of the sections is where you have a lot of data, and the answers are very clear and easy to evaluate. You win or you lose. That's the machine's home territory. That's where you're going to see superhuman performance becomes possible. The second area on that map is where you have deep data, but the answers are more fuzzy. It's not obvious what the right answer is to whether you should invest in crypto tomorrow. Now, the machines can give you some help there. They can help you draft questions, lay out options, think through ideas, but ultimately you as a human have to judge. The third area is where the data is thin, and that's the frontier where the machine can sound confident and make mistakes and therefore run amok. So those two questions can place almost any task on the map, but there is one important complication here, and it's actually a pretty big complication. It's that the map doesn't actually have these really nice, smooth borders. Inside any single tool, the ability is more jagged, not straight lines. There's lots of rough edges. And that you cannot always tell where exactly they are. So how do you find these edges before you trust a machine with an important task? Well, researchers don't go by feel. They give the machine standardized exams that are called benchmarks. It's basically a fixed set of tasks with some known answers so that every system takes the exact same tests and the scores can be fairly compared. You actually already met one of these in lesson 3. Remember ImageNet, the yearly contest? That was a benchmark. Today, there are hundreds of exam-style benchmarks with thousands of questions across dozens of subject areas. Coding benchmarks counting many real software bugs a system can fix, and public arenas where thousands of people blindly compare 2 chatbots and vote, building leaderboards that anyone, including yourself, can look up. When a company claims expert-level AI, that claim should trace to a score on one of these formal tests. But a score is only the start, and one famous example helps show us why. In 2023, the maker of ChatGPT announced that its new model had passed the bar exam. That's the test for becoming a lawyer, by the way. And ChatGPT scored in the top 10% of test takers, or the 90th percentile. That score was real, and the headlines were absolutely everywhere. But then a researcher asked a critical question. Top 10% of who? That comparison group, the context, was dominated by people retaking the exam after failing. The ones who score far below the average. So, against typical first-time test takers, the model landed near the 62nd percentile. That's a lot less impressive. But against the people who actually passed, the practicing lawyers, it was roughly the 48th percentile, even less impressive. Oh, and the essay section, it was around the 15th percentile. Imagine that. Same machine, same answers, only the yardstick changed. So let's review our toolkit. There are 2 questions that place the task on a map. How deep is the practice data, and can the question be checked? Just remember that the borders on this map are jagged, and they're also invisible. When used critically, benchmarks can help you evaluate where the borders of these tools may actually sit. Which brings us back to Watson, the machine, not the man. After Jeopardy, IBM pointed its champion at a far bigger prize, recommending cancer treatments. If we run our 2 questions, trivia was home turf, an ocean of text to learn from, and every clue had one checkable answer. So Watson could be drilled against decades of past games before it ever faced Ken Jennings. Cancer care sits in the far corner of the map. Every patient's different, so the data is thin and it's messy. And there's no instant scoreboard. A treatment's true result can take years to appear. One flagship hospital partner spent $62 million. Then they shelved the tool before it ever advised on a real patient. Journalists later reported internal documents calling test recommendations unsafe and incorrect. By 2022, IBM had sold the health business off in a variety of pieces. The machine did not get dumber between the game show and the hospital. It was the same masterpiece, deployed across borders. What Jeopardy had, deep data and a clear scoreboard, medicine could not offer it. The next question, how do you actually work with these tools so you get their best instead of their worst? That's the next video, and I'll see you there.